Good morning. It's really good to be here. Thank you, Christine. I was at a conference not too long ago where one of the speakers began by saying, as I don't know many of you here, I asked for a list of you all, broken down by age and sex. But he continued, as I look at you now, I can see that most of you have been broken down by age and by sex. Well, I know that you've been keeping your hands to yourselves, so I wouldn't dream of saying this to you this morning, but of course I don't know many of you, and so it'd be good to have a little bit of exchange at the end of this. So I'll try to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time for conversation. What I want to touch on this morning is, I suppose, the courage of the preacher. I've called the session Danger in the Pulpit, the sermon I want to preach but never quite can. And my experience is that if I ask a room full of preachers if they have such a sermon, most of them do, and they tell me very quickly what it is, with great animation, and how it goes, the subject, the message, where they want to stress, and the general direction in the congregation they'd be looking at when saying all the underlined bits. It's all there, ready to go, but like Mount Etna, it never quite erupts as you expect it to. The odd bit of hot lava trickles out occasionally, but the sermon is mostly dormant, except inside, where it's pretty hot stuff. I count it as one of the great privileges of my life that for the last 18 months of his life, I befriended the actor and comedian Kenneth Williams. If you know him, you'll instantly picture him, probably in a Carry On film, such as Carry On Cleo, where he played Caesar. You'll remember the scene where he comes back from conquering to his annoyed wife, Calpurnia, played by Joan Sims, and tries to please her by offering all the gifts he's brought back from his expeditions. "Look," he says, "I've brought you cheeses from Holland." "I've got Dutch cheeses," she says. "And I've brought you onions from Spain." "I've got Spanish onions," she says. "And I've brought you precious stones from Gaul." "I've got gallstones and all," she says. And we later find Williams running down the imperial corridors from the fateful dagger, crying, come on, you all know it, "Infamy, infamy, they've all got it, infamy." There are Sundays you feel a little bit like that, aren't there? Now, Kenneth Williams was, like most of us, a real mass of contradictions. He was a mixture of the past's bruising. He had an inquiring intelligence. There was a loneliness. There was an outrageousness. He was a man who used that very loud, unmistakable voice and then went back to a quiet, unknown flat. And if I had to sum him up, I'd say he was desperate to be looked at and terrified of being seen. And then I asked myself, is that me on a Sunday morning? Desperate to be looked at, got all my churchy clobber on, climbing up into that huge box above everyone, or in some churches, clinging onto that lectern that looks like a posh deck chair. And then when I'm there, when everybody's looking at me, I'm scared of being seen. So I go undercover, camouflage, self-censor, the master of the understatement, as cautious as Caiaphas, if I'm honest. and probably worried that if I had said something that might have touched a nerve or two, I'd be in the car going back home a little later thinking, they've all got it in for me. And if as a preacher I do this time and time again, it not only screws me up inside because of what I'm not saying, but it begins to question my integrity as a preacher of the gospel. I end up feeling as I think Pontius Pilate might feel about the creed. Delighted to get a mention. A little bit unsure as to the role I'm actually playing. But if I'm given the privilege of preaching, and I paralyze the privilege and become part of the warm shallows of the church, and not an invitation into the deeper currents of the spiritual adventure we call Christian faith, I'm not living up to my vocation. Now, I guess this makes us feel a bit uncomfortable because we all do it. And we often do it for very good reasons. If I said what I really thought about the lamentable level of money they give, they'd probably never come back. If I preached what I really think about same-sex relationships, I know the group who'd write to the bishop. If I gave them the Ascension Day sermon I really want to give them, I think I'd hurt some of them because they believe things differently to me, and I want to build them up. I don't want to damage them. I want to talk about my real self today, but will it weaken me as a leader? If I mention stewardship, they'll automatically think I'm talking about their wallets, and so on. I suspect we could add another 400 examples if we each opened up now about the sermon we want to preach but never quite can. And please, don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about us being fearful about a subject or two I'd casually like to bring up because it's topical or controversial, adding to the opinionate of today's papers. No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the things we believe are gospel, the news that Jesus, the body language of God, Jesus, brought into human lives to change life towards the true and the good. We've got a God who's got something to say to us. We have lives that want to wake up to God. And as Evelyn Underhill famously said, at the end of the day, the only interesting thing about religion is God. But the preacher's job, as you know, is not just to preach the gospel. It is to get the gospel heard. That's a different thing. So the how of a sermon, though it's a little bit embarrassing to talk about because it sounds like we're into theatricals or it's somehow inauthentic, the how of a sermon is vital. Because just by saying the right words and hoping that they work is not the preacher's vocation. We have the message, the faith, the hope, the challenge, and our vocation is to work to make them heard. Help them translate into human will. The devil laughs when people are bored, unengaged, made to listen to more dead metaphors and a know-it-all churchy speak language that doesn't resonate anywhere. Is the preacher just the ecclesiastical equivalent of a member of the sealed knot, helping to reenact another century in costume and script, only to go home as if nothing's changed? If we're doing that, we are bearing false witness. Was Kierkegaard right when, watching the maneuvers of a mouse trying to get the cheese without getting caught, he reflected on the amusement of God over the clever moves of his ministers? Or is the preacher daring to make the honest, heart-work conversations of Nazareth the conversations of now? Is the preacher engaged in the work of the gospel that changes our human full stops into commas, with the message that God loves us just as we are, and God loves us so much, God doesn't want us to stay like that? I mentioned Nazareth just now. We often talk about the teachings of Jesus. We rarely talk about his preaching. And what we can tell from the Gospels about his preaching is important to take on board when we're thinking about our courage. William Brosand has studied carefully and concludes that whatever else we can tell about Jesus' preaching, we can say this. First of all, it was dialogical. That is, he preached in response, in dialogue to challenges, to questions, to traditions. You know, tradition can just sometimes be peer pressure by the dead. Someone comes up to him and asks something. One of those religious types tries to snipe him with a biblical bullet. Or someone uses tradition and show Jesus up, and he engages with the inquirer. He dialogues with the puzzled disciple or the provocative. He engages with the tradition, the culture, the empire. His preaching is in response, in dialogue. It's an important thing to remember as a preacher. And then you can tell about Jesus' preaching that it was proclamatory. He makes bold and authoritative statements. He begins Mark's gospel marching onto the human stage, preaching, proclaiming. And people said, "Oh, he speaks with authority." He often proclaims with irony. He's often direct. Be perfect, he says. Beware of the Pharisees and their hypocrisy. Today, this is fulfilled. He was proclamatory. We can also tell that Jesus only preaches with occasional self-reference. Not much in the synoptic tradition at all. He tends to not want to be known. He resists flattery. Jesus often escapes when people are praising him. He's itinerant, so that the recognition of him doesn't become static and the base of some sort of personality worship. Lesson: do beware of the messages that you are unknowingly transmitting by self-reference. I once heard an archdeacon begin a sermon saying, "My wife and I have just come back from our holiday in the Seychelles." And the people in the church, I could feel, were saying, "I think we pay him a bit too much." Or, "I'd love to go on holiday. I can't afford it." Messaging, transmitting. He was just trying to find a way of capturing their attention, like we all do when we come back from holiday and we think, "Oh, I've got to write a sermon. I'll talk about my holiday." But messaging was going on subconsciously. And lastly, as we were hearing from Paula, the thing that you can tell about Jesus' preaching was he was persistently figurative. You know, the Good Samaritan never existed. Prodigal son never existed. Jesus made them up. He made stuff up all the time. He polishes his metaphors, his hyperbole, his parable, his allegory, all the rhetorical devices. He's persistently figurative. He preached the gospel, but he wanted it to be heard. So he became a verbal artist. He was acrobatic with his language, and he puzzled and he delighted in equal measure. Okay, so back to our world. It's a fact that many congregations and preachers often prefer civility to honesty. So preachers who dare to risk courage in preaching the gospel often feel either foolish because views can be pretty hardened out there and serious listening isn't always going on much, so you can end up feeling foolish. Or we can feel threatened because the passion to keep things as they are is strong in communities and hearts. Never forget that sin can be a surprisingly conservative thing, not open to the Spirit of God. And we can feel vulnerable as we riskily expose to the world our imperfections and faults and insecurities and inability with words, and let's face it, our hypocrisy, as we talk about things we don't live up to. We find, by the way, and I'm now speaking to the clergy of you out there, clergy find this incredibly difficult to talk to one another about, because we secretly think that the priest up the road is doing it better than we are. So clergy gatherings can be torturous about these sort of things. It's a bit like a congress of masseurs. No one ever wants to turn their back. No wonder the mother whale, gave her baby really good advice when she said, "Beware, my dear, because it's when you're spouting you're most likely to get harpooned." Add to this the fact that many of us in the pulpit are actually introverts, finding ourselves in an extrovert role. And it's exhausting, especially if you have to pick up pieces afterwards. What we're talking about, as I say, is the preacher's courage, which, by the way, is not the same thing as being without fear. It just means having the fear, but doing it anyway. St. Catherine of Siena, proclaim the truth and do not be silent through fear. Now, whereas I'm really drawn to Gandhi's image of the evangelism of the rose, that is, it's not what we say that draws people, but who we are as a person or a community. It's the beauty of what and who we are that converts. Well, nevertheless, I believe in the sacramentality of language. I think Christians should spend as much time preparing their words in worship as they do preparing the font or the altar, because words achieve amazing things, life-changing, life-opening moments when words arrive at the intellect by way of the heart. That phrase, by way of the heart, is the title I've given to a collection of sermons just out and on sale in the shop. You'll be breathless to learn. It's a book that amazingly reveals to you that I can't do anything of what I'm just about to tell you to do. But it is also a book that comes out of a belief of mine that, frankly, if you are struggling to think about what you can preach on at the moment, if your Saturday night is a bit of a slog, frankly, you've nodded off. You're spiritually snoring. There is too much that needs exposing exploring, examining. Too much that needs challenging, correcting, subverting. We are living in a preacher's time. This conference couldn't be at a better time. This is a preacher's time. And in the same way that Martin Luther King never once said, "I have a nightmare," we need to take this opportunity seriously and with great hope. The other Martin Luther once said, "Even if I knew the world would end tomorrow, I would still plant my little apple tree." Well, there's a lot of planting to be done. And Bill Brosen says the preacher's question is always this: what does the Holy Spirit want to say to these people in this place through these texts, in this time? We are, as Walter Brueggemann says, audacious as preachers, because we're daring to break the silence. And just as the bread of the Eucharist makes you more hungry for God, it's the food that makes you more hungry, so must our words seek to deepen the longing for God and show up the famine of our land and the hope of God's horizon. And I talk about courage because these are, as we've been hearing, strange times. Leaders campaign in graffiti and then they govern in tweets. With excited talk of fake news, we get distracted, it's hoped, from fake politicians or populist slogans and generalizations that smooth over complexity or the truth. Now, that's not new, of course. It's just particularly bad at the moment. And such abuse spreads across the globe very quickly. It leads to confusion about what we believe, what we want, what we think's possible. Consumerism makes words seductive. Technology gives us too many of them. Our care for them decreases as they proliferate. The first one to draw a breath is called the listener. And George Steiner once argued, we're living in this aftermath of the broken covenant between the Word and the world. And the problem is that the same ears that listen to politicians and salespeople and news commentators are listening to you too. They've got the same ears on. We're living at this time with a great deal of cynical use of language. It's what's been called society's truth decay. I mentioned that over a noisy lunch the other day to a friend. He thought I'd be talking about the benefits of fluoride this morning. But what I'm wondering is, as a society, if we're losing interest in truth, whether there's a loss of conviction that there is objective truth and facts, is it now less important than opinions, crisis chatter, infotainment? Is to be interesting more important than being right? Is there a declining value in accuracy? Is what matters not veracity but impact? Is dishonesty therefore not being held to account as it used to be? Is lying just a laugh because it messes up the systems of value? Well, it's tempting to blame many political and state leaders if this is the case. Some seem to think that what is truthful is merely what reinforces the mood of the crowd. There's a lot of changing honest complexity into dishonest simplicity. Don't ever, as preacher, change honest complexity into dishonest simplicity. People sniff it out eventually. History, thankfully, is peppered with those who warn us about such political manipulation. Alexander Hamilton, him of the famous musical, one of America's founding fathers, argued for a system of constitutional checks and balances to guard against the possibility, and I now quote him, of a man unprincipled in private life and bold in his temper, one day arising, who might mount the hobby horse of popularity and flatter and fall in with all the nonsense of the zealots of the day, in order to embarrass the government and throw things into confusion, that he may ride the storm and direct the whirlwind. Wow, imagine that. Could it ever be? Perhaps I think that's why the first president was importantly said to have believed, "I cannot tell a lie." As you know, those such as George Orwell, Hannah Arendt, warn from experience that totalitarian rule ultimately takes hold by slow injections of falsity that people then begin to repeat. And so for all practical purposes, Orwell concluded, the lie becomes the truth. It spreads, it leads to a distrust in experts, the belief that, say, science, if inconvenient somehow, is a conspiracy. It leads to historical studies that don't back up your arguments, well, just revise it. Journalism begins to reflect a sort of selfie stick, seemingly holding things at a distance, but really just reflecting yourself. And religion, too, can hide its darker truths with this pious speak, deference to authority, and expect the congregations to go amen. If there's anything at all to what I'm saying here, this is dangerous. This is dangerous. This is a preacher's time. In the Gospel, according to St. John, Pilate asks Jesus, "What is truth?" But he doesn't hang around to find out the answer. After all, the crowd's putting on the pressure outside. But communities of faith are formed to ask that same question, what is truth? And then to stick around together, pursuing the answer in worship and relationship. A church, a chaplaincy, should be one of the antidotes to any fashion of falsity. A group of people committed to the pursuit of truth in dialogue, in fellowship, each ready to be corrected when necessary, passionate about accuracy, fearless in seeing the past and present and reaching to the unknown. One of the roles of a church is to remind us that truth has other forms than facts. Sometimes truth is far too important to be literalistic about. The truth that's expressed artistically, musically, in narrative, in myth, is the truth that's always part of the human inner landscape. So, the sense of life as a fragile gift, the unignorable intrusions of mystery when love or loss enter it, the intuition that somehow we need saving from ourselves, from self-destruction, by a love that is beyond and within. So, as I've said, I believe that when we walk into a church, we've walked into a poem. The liturgy is poetry in motion, and we fail to understand its beauty if we miss its density of suggestion, eavesdropping on the soul, the sensitive state of consciousness that poetry prompts. We are not spectators in worship. We are pursuing truth that translates into living. So, how in this time to approach giving the sermon you really want to give? Well, first of all, it leads me back to that word poetry. I've written and said a lot about this, so I'm not going to go on too much. But as Wallace Stevens, the American poet, said, people ought to like poetry the way children like snow. It's thrilling. It has a slightly icy presence, but it helps us reimagine the landscape, the world, and you can see your own breath. So any preacher of courage in this linguistically cynical world is going to be poetic, a shaper of words to be heard for the sake of truth. You're not running a spiritual kindergarten, but a university of the soul, where we use words that aren't just fired off, but which help us hear, which distill, are not stagnant because they're moving. They're not cliched. They are gym-toned. Words which understand us and are there to excite underused imagination. I often think it ought to be really on the notice boards of our church. Welcome to St. Aldate's. This is a gymnasium for your underused imagination. Try it. We need words that are not afraid of difficulty. Difficulty can be a really important thing in the spiritual life. And a sermon can be drawn from like a fountain. It doesn't have to be a one flowing river with one idea or argument. Or as a friend of mine once heard a preacher here in Oxford actually say, and 18thly, just a quick reminder, by the way, people say in surveys that in the top 3 things they want when they go to church is a good sermon. They also say in the top 3 things that disappoint them about going to church is the sermon. If we're to preach in a world of alternative facts and cynical speech, we must speak in fresh, startling ways that believe in words, believes in the heart and mind from which they come, believe in the relationships which words seek to build and not fragment. Preacher, take your words seriously, or you will simply help us to diminish. And then, on this route to courage, the preacher is going to have to be a prophet. Now, this is a word we like to use when we're a bit worked up. But please note, just because you are angry doesn't make you a prophet. A prophet does not just get up, sound off, and clear off, feeling a bit better for being so obviously right. Right, I've told them, now it's up to them. John Donne said that it isn't the wit or the eloquence or the intellect of a preacher that moves his or her listeners. It is, he said, their nearness. How near is this speaker to my humanity? And first, the prophet must be speaking out of a humanity to a humanity. The prophet is looking into the future and then reporting back, warning us who we've become and where it's leading us, cattle prodding us into some amendments, but not as a fiery, rapid ranter, but as someone who wants to help reconcile the world to God and God to the world. So prophets are not about condemnation. They are about restoration. And often, this still means that the preacher needs to have courage because things need to be said that won't go down well with some. It's really annoying, but the gospel gets in the way of trying to keep everyone happy on Sunday. But the prophetic preacher speaks confidently, with conviction, but not reflecting, please, not reflecting the poisonous ridicule, the sarcasm, the demonization, the cruelty of the present climate. To be truly prophetic will mean not imitating what you condemn. The prophet is working to dispel illusions without leaving you disillusioned. Dispel illusions, do not leave them disillusioned. The prophet has passion for God's justice and will often be angry, but the purpose of preaching is to bring people home to God, including yourself. And this finally, on this route to courage, means that the preacher will often be a protester, protesting against the status quo, protesting on behalf of those who haven't the privilege of a public voice, protesting for change. And there's a lot of protesting to be done in this world at the moment where, frankly, as has been said, if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu. Where we exhaust ourselves with competitive, gladiatorial attitudes, where we earn our black belts in shopping to impress people we don't like, where a move to the right is shifting the way we talk about the most important things: asylum, safety, refuge, the poor, the minority, the vulnerable, the other, human rights, equal human dignity. And beware, many talk as if this shift is of God, is Christian. A lot of our protest is going to have to be very close to home. Barbara Brown Taylor, that remarkable preacher, reminds us all that the problem is many of the people in need of saving are in churches, and at least part of what they need saving from is the idea that God sees the world the same way they do. Christians will often need to take the lead in correcting attitudes and situations that they have helped bring about. Many will tell us that we should stay out of the political, assuming God, Jesus, and the Bible are all apolitical. But as these folk tell us that faith should be personal, protected, pious, we look at the Christ whose execution was not personal, protected, pious. It was public and brutal and political. They didn't crucify him because he was a nice preacher. His message had consequences that weren't welcome. Sometimes you might get applause, preacher, but sometimes you will know the cost too. Your spirit might be crucified, and in some places in our world, your life might be at risk. But Jesus warned us. He was serious. And there is darkness, as we have said, in this world at the moment. We well know lives are being ruined and diminished and even ended by militarized regimes and hunger and poverty and terrorism and hate crime, an inability to imagine what it might be like to be someone other than us. The real danger is that we start to fail to notice. We get used to the TV pictures, we get used to the language that the press and politicians at large are casually using. So yes, we do need to climb that tree. All this increasing darkness in strange times, who will rescue the victims of it? Who, when society wants to push a person into the dark background, out of sight, will shine a light and say, "Don't you dare." Who will rage at the senseless death of children? At the discrimination and hate shown to the vulnerable? At the convenient categorization of human beings into first, second, and third class citizens? Who will rescue from the darkness? The answer, the one who believes in God. Not a God utilized to back a political campaign, not a God weaponized into a big version of my prejudice, not a God who likes some more than others, the God who loves equally all that he has made. This is the protest against the darkness of our age. As Brueggemann says, Christians have a subversion, that is a subversion, an underground version of reality, a different version lying there waiting to be made real, God's subversion of reality. And the great poet and protester Mary, she sang it in her Magnificat, singing God's subversion into the world. My guess is that the sermon you can never quite preach is a sermon about what it might feel like to live a bit more in that kingdom of God, the subversion. How living there, how letting it reshape your imagination and your priorities will change the world and your locality and your church and your togetherness. And if it's true, preach it. But because we need to keep people, and we need to pay the bills, and we like to be liked by the bishop, Jung said that whatever we ignore for the sake of ambition will one day return knife in hand to take its revenge. I told Westcott students that on their final night before going to their parishes. In a very dark Compline, I felt like Peter Cushing. But we do adopt camouflage in the pulpit, and we hope to say things between the lines that they hope they might pick up. But preacher, they know how you voted. They know. So what they want to know before you preach is, do you care for them? Are you listening to them? Are you as a preacher as keen to listen as you are to speak? Do you love them and the community you serve? And then, if so, okay, say what you have to say, why you say the things you say, and we'll see how it goes. Aristotle gives very wise advice when he says, always leave your listeners on good terms. Speak your mind, not just your heart. Yes, the truth will set you free, but before it does that, it tends to piss you off a bit. That's okay. It's called growth. We all need it. But don't make the mistake that everyone cares for something as much as you do. Preach from your scars and not from your wounds. Do not bleed over people. Don't make the mistake of thinking that caring passionately about an issue will automatically translate into preaching convincingly about it. Persuasion is more than passion. But when the gospel needs to protest a state of affairs, it protests and hopes you can see this is of God and not because I listen to Radio 4. And therefore, I'm sorry, I'm turning the heat up. The odd in God eventually has to come out. So, today, if we don't stand for something, we are going to fall for anything. Stand for truth. Not even God can work with unreality. Stand for a reverence of language and its proper use. And as Martin Luther King said, expediency will always ask the question, is it politic? And vanity will always ask, is it popular? But conscience always asks, is it right? And there comes a time when one must take a position that isn't safe or politic or popular, but you take it because your conscience tells you it is right. He was the supreme example of preacher as poet, prophet, and protester. If you prefer your Anglican divines, remember John Donne, who said that a sermon should act like thunder that clears the air. That is, not frighten people, but clears the air. Or Lancelot Andrewes, who said that our charge is to preach not what for the present they would hear, but what in another day they would wish they had heard. Resonance, not relevance. And therefore, as the American preacher Fred Craddock used to say, the question will always be not whether the church is dying, but whether it is giving its life for the world. If you're clinging onto that pulpit, maybe it's because it's a raft in a storm. A sermon isn't a text, it's an event. It's inviting us out of the world of consumers into the world of citizens. I love preaching because I discover what I believe when I write one, and even more when I preach one. Theology for me is what happens on the way to the pulpit. It isn't a hobby, it's survival. To preach, to speak of our faith is so full of love, but also longing at what is most important to us finally eludes us. We keep going through hints and guesses and glimpses and confirmations and epiphanies and doubts. We shape our collage of God. It's beautiful and it's urgent for a thirsty, very parched world. And 80 years ago, W.H. Auden wrote a poem that reminded us, all I have is a voice to undo the folded lie. The lie is folded in newspapers, in lives, in perceptions, in relationships, in power, in the masks that are eating into our faces. You have a voice to undo it. To preach is a privilege. To be poet, prophet, protester, a person with renewed courage, preaching and preaching until others have that relationship with God that you only wish you had yourself. Thank you for listening. We have a few minutes for questions. There's one over there.
Hi, my name's Kat. I certainly have things I would love to preach. I'm also, like probably many people here, someone who preaches from the lectionary. Sometimes the lectionary absolutely delivers what I need to be able to preach the thing I want to, and sometimes it's just really not in the same place at all. So do you have any wisdom for those of us who preach from the lectionary?
Well, it's all part of God's warped sense of humour. Never quite provide you what you need to sound off your own prejudices sometimes. It's a two-way conversation between the text and you. I would say that if you approach the text hoping it's going to back up your cause, the great thing about any conversation is how it leaves you at the end of the conversation. So you might even end up with a better thing to say after you've had a go. But that's rather idealistic. I've had a few awful Saturday nights as well. But I have nothing to offer except keep at it, because things unravel in that dialogue.
When we listen to God, surely it is God who gives us the words to say. It is God who shows us how we convey to our congregations his message, his truth, his honest words, and if there are things that we need to say, God will either give us the right time to say them in the right way, or he'll tell us to shut up.
That would be great, except Pope Nicholas V might have said that. And there are many preachers who are speaking words that I don't think are of God. And I'm one of them. I just don't know it. I sometimes think I'm full of God, and gosh, if only they would understand, then it would all make... No, we are all failing, and we need, although we have to be proclamatory, we also have to have humility. Humility, of course, means literally near to the humus, near to the ground, near to the earth. And as Barbara Brown-Taylor says, as soon as I start speaking and thinking that what I'm saying is what God really believes, it's time for me to blow into a paper bag. I need to sit down and reassess. So we do things sincerely and honestly and after prayer and thought, but we also have to say, I'm probably wrong. Because we often read your sermons from 20 years ago and see if you still believe it. If that's the case, we're on a journey too.
Yes, sermons take different periods of time, but assuming that a sermon were to take 7 days, you've talked all about the importance of words. When do you start to give words priority? Wednesday, Friday, when would you begin?
I'm the sort of person I've just got a sort of wordy mind, you can probably tell. So I'm like, please don't get the image for too long here, but I do a lot of theologizing in the bath, okay? La, 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 get that image out of your mouth. But I'm always thinking. I read the readings for the day, and a good sort of 10 days in advance, and I let it percolate, and I try and sift and try to find words that are fresh, because I will naturally fall back on the stale cliche. I'm really good at those. I'm thinking of words instantly after I've read the passage, and how, as I say, if you're going to preach the gospel, how can you help make it heard? And that's the challenge. So for me, words are key, and they're always percolating. For other preachers, there are lots of other ways you can be doing this. I mean, if you're into visual theology, use your visuals, It's not just words, but I do think we need to take words much more seriously than we often do. Do not bore people, it is a sin. One more? Yes.
Thank you. There were lots of interesting words in there. One word you didn't use, which might fit in with why we get afraid to preach things, is the word controversial. And sometimes to be controversial is a temptation, and isn't necessarily doing those things about building people up. So I wondered where you think the word controversial fits in with preaching some of these sermons that we get afraid to preach.
Yes, and one person's controversial preacher is not another person's controversial preacher. So that's why I was really trying to suggest that, although we get this image that it's going to be great if you're just angry and you're going to sound off, because actually that's not the purpose. The purpose is restoration, not condemnation. I really believe that. And therefore, you are always trying to hold in relationship with the people you're speaking to, even when you need to say difficult things. So I wouldn't be worried if somebody said I was controversial. I think once or twice in my life they may have said that. That doesn't bother me. If I feel I'm still being truthful and trying to be as authentic as I can in what I'm saying, so be it. What are names at the end of the day? Oh. I think God is telling me now to shut up. Thank you.